President Cyril Ramaphosa reshuffling his executive last night, bringing in ministers and deputy ministers into their new portfolios. Acting Tongana is in Parliament, but first we start with Ziyanda Ngcobo. She's live to us now from the Union Buildings in Pretoria. And Ziyanda, the reaction the morning after is largely that the President managed to not make any new enemies with this reshuffle. To what extent could that be true?
Well, it is quite true, Ayanda, that the President, played his cards quite safely when actually making this cabinet reshuffle. But, the ramifications of the moves that he's made will only be felt and seen as the days go by. For an example, Thandi Modise will no longer be Speaker of Parliament and has now moved to the Ministry of Defence, replacing Nosiviwe Mapisa Nqakula. Now, having to replace a Speaker of Parliament, just literally days after, civil unrest has also come into question. You also sort of have, I wouldn't say confusion, but I suppose a lack of clarity of how the security cluster is going to operate now, because parts of the security cluster will form part of, within the presidency, while you have Police Minister Bheki Cele still remaining as a standalone, so to speak, because the state security functions will now operate within the presidency. So Ayanda, certainly in terms of the politics of the ANC, considering KwaZulu-Natal and the politics of that particular province, and not wanting to have perhaps Bheki Cele also removed, as some have criticized the president for not actually taking action against him. He's maintained what many have described as balancing the internal factional battles within the ANC. However, there are still questions on the functionings of the cabinet and how productive and effective it will be.
And Ziyanda, the President also in some quarters coming under criticism, or coming under fire rather, for still playing politics by and large with this new cabinet, especially when you consider the movement or the lack thereof in KZN. For one, Sibongiseni Dhlomo, now the Deputy Health Minister, despite the track record he had when he was leading the KZN Health Department.
Absolutely. You'll remember that Dr. Sibongiseni Dhlomo's legacy just before he actually became the chairperson of the Health Portfolio Committee. He was largely criticized for badly managing the oncology crisis, really, that was faced in KwaZulu-Natal. You'll recall that the DA in particular was one of the parties that was leading the charge, calling for him to step down when he was still Health MEC in KwaZulu-Natal. And as you've mentioned, the politics of KwaZulu-Natal is quite complex. It's the biggest block of the ANC in terms of branches, but also the removal of Dr. Zweli Mkhize, who doesn't particularly belong to either one of the factions. In fact, one would say that he's liked by both the factions and is popular with both the factions, whether you talk about RET or even the president's faction. You can tell that the president was managing dynamics, especially after the recent unrest that we've seen as a result of the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma, but also the question of, the relationship that the current president, I should say, has with his bloc in KwaZulu-Natal. So questions around Sibongiseni Dhlomo now becoming the deputy minister, what kind of impact he will have, what impact he had as the chairperson of the Health Portfolio Committee, and you can tell that there was a management of the politics again, Ayanda, in particular when it comes to KwaZulu-Natal. If you read the resignation letter of Dr. Zweli Mkhize, the first line says, "Thank you very much for today's meeting." One that gives us an indication that the former health minister was basically asked to resign, and I suppose in the political world it makes it more palatable if President Ramaphosa were to actually want to see Zweli Mkhize return to his cabinet, as opposed to having ousted him and having to explain why you fired him and are now bringing him back. We know that he's taking that SIU report on judicial review. through. But certainly, again, going back to your question, this plays into the bigger internal factional politics of the ANC, Ayanda, and the president managing that, making questionable appointments, including that of Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, and I suppose also consolidating his power within his own political party, as of course there's also still that 2022 elective Congress.
And very quickly, Ziyanda, I mean, I'm just looking back to some of the sentiment that was shared by the president back in 2019 when he made his maiden cabinet appointment, essentially. Part of what he said is that those who've been appointed on that day in 2019, their performance individually and collectively will be closely monitored against specific outcomes. Where implementation is unsatisfactory, action will be taken. With that in mind, those who are unscathed by this cabinet reshuffle, does that make sense, or has the president missed an opportunity here?
Well, you remember, actually, off the back of what you've just said, Ayanda, that the president actually made his ministers sign performance agreements, a commitment that if they fail to perform, they acknowledge what is he made them acknowledge what was expected of them from a performance perspective. But he said, remember that term consequence management. Consequence management was one of, the buzzwords of President Cyril Ramaphosa when he came into power. And when you speak about consequence management, if you look at the statements of the EFF, they're questioning where's the consequence management of Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams when you look at what's happened to the SABC. When we talk consequence management, what is to be said of Arts and Culture Minister Nathi Mthethwa and his performance within the arts sector? If we talk performance management, Ayanda, even within the current movements that the president has made, some are questioning the gains of Kumbuzo Nchabeni in the small business development department as she now moves to communications. And so there are many ministers where, when you look at their track record, when you look at what they've actually done, you don't get a sense, Ayanda, that there's actually is still a commitment to go back to those performance agreements, to look at what was required of them and whether or not they've actually performed in this particular regard. So to a large extent, it has been a management of the internal ANC politics, and the president unable to separate what happens within his own political party and what he does within the state. And I think the example of Dr. Mkhize is quite apt, given the fact that there was mounting pressure on the president to do something, but seemingly both Mkhize not really wanting to resign until he was asked to do so yesterday, and the president not willing to act up until several factors. Even the cabinet reshuffle was prompted by the recent unrest, many are saying, and the fact that a lot of the changes have got to do with the ramifications of what happened during the unrest, as opposed to a cabinet reshuffle based on performance and consequence management.
Ziyanda Ngcobo, thanks very much indeed for that take. She's live to us there from the Union Buildings.